Hey guys, I wanted to make another video on the electrical conduction to the heart and how it relates to our EKG. Uh, but the last video I did was on the normal conduction, so I wanted to give you two examples of an abnormal conduction. The first one we got here is ventricular tachycardia. So as we did before, let's start at the SA node and work our way down. So if we remember, for the SA node, what we're looking for is P waves. And looking at this strip, we can't find any P waves at all. So our next question would have been, do our P waves march out, followed by are they positive or negative, and then look at the P wave shape, and is that shape consistent? So let's move on to the next piece. So the next thing that we would be looking at is the AV node. And that would be the PR interval. So we do have our waves here. If we kind of look at this complex, this little down portion leads to our Q. This spike would be our R, and way down here would be our S. But as we said before, we don't have a P wave, so we don't really have a PR interval. Our next question would have been, if we had a PR interval, is it normal, and is that interval consistent? So without any P waves or any PR interval, what we can say is that atrial conduction is not happening prior to the ventricles. There's no conduction above the ventricles. So that brings us to the last stop on our conduction pathway, which is the ventricles. And that's taking a look at the QRS. So again, this little dip here would be our Q, this spike would be our R, and this would be our S, probably stopping somewhere around here. So the first question we would ask ourselves is, what is the width of the QRS? So if we find a complex that's fairly close to a line, this one's pretty good, we can measure the start of the Q to the tail end of the S and measure those boxes in between. And if we do that, we find our width to be about 120 milliseconds, which we can consider to be wide. And if we remember before, wide complexes, one of the things that we can assume is that it's probably a ventricular rhythm. Moving on to our next question, we're going to look at our R to R interval to see if we have a regular rhythm. If we were to march these out, we would see that it's probably fairly regular. Our next one would be our rate. And so if we find an R wave that's fairly close to a thick line of a big box, this one will work just fine. And we count out our big boxes. So this would be 300, 150. We can see our next beat's fairly close to that 300. I would probably call that rate somewhere around 280 or so. So pretty fast. Our next thing is we would be looking at is the complex positive or negative. This is something that I always thought was kind of hard when I was going through school because I never could figure out where I'm supposed to look on some of these big wide complexes like this. So if we just kind of go back to that QRS and draw kind of an imaginary line, This will do. This kind of gives us a better reference point. So is the complex more above this line, positive, or below? And we see that really deep S wave gives this more of a negative look. So we would say we have a negative complex. So what is that telling us? Well, if this is lead 2 here, and this is the direction that we're looking, this complex is not originating from the atria because we don't have any P waves prior to our QRS. And we know that we have a waveform that is starting in the ventricles and heading away from us. So this would be a ventricular tachycardia. And because it's all headed in the same direction and uniform, it would be monomorphic. So let's try another example. So here we have a junctional rhythm, and we'll do the same thing. Let's start at the SA node looking at our P waves. And as you can see, we have P waves here. So our next question would be, do our P waves march out? And looking at them, they do happen at a regular rate. Our third question would be, are they positive or negative? And as we can see, these are definitely negative P waves. So what does that tell us? Instead of this originating from the SA node and heading down towards our lead 2, this is conducting somewhere else in the atria and heading away. Or I should say, conducting above the ventricles and heading away. The next thing we're going to look at is, do the P waves have the same shape? And they do. So we know that this is happening from a single point in the heart, above the ventricles, and heading away from us. Next, let's look at the AV node. And again, this will be our PR interval. So we do have P waves, and we do have R waves. And if we were to measure this out, we would see that our PR interval is roughly 100 milliseconds. So that's within normal limits. And we do have P waves that conduct prior to our QRS, or atrial contraction prior to our ventricles. The next thing is our PR interval consistent? And it is. So we're definitely having some atrial conduction prior to our ventricles, but we know it's not happening from the SA node. Last thing we're going to look at is the ventricle conduction, or the QRS. And we're going to start out with the width. These are fairly narrow complexes. If we kind of measure it out, it looks to be just about one box width, maybe a little bit bigger. So our width would probably be roughly 40 milliseconds or so, maybe a little bit bigger. So well within normal limits. Next, we would look at our R to R, and we would find that this is fairly regular. And lastly, we can look at our rate. I will say this is actually a 6-second strip, so we can quickly just count our QRS complexes and see 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, that we have 6. So our rate is probably roughly around 60 beats per minute. Lastly, we're going to look at is our complex positive or negative, and we can see that the overall direction is positive. So what is this telling us? Well, we have a regular rhythm at a rate of 60 beats per minute that has ventricular conduction heading down towards our lead 2, but also away from that for the atrium. And there's only really one spot in here where that can come from, and that would be the AV junction. So this would be a junctional rhythm. Hope this helped. Let me know if you have any questions. Thanks.